All right, good afternoon. Thank you guys so much for being here. Look at all these people here to talk about books on a Sunday. This is amazing. A round of applause for you guys. Woo! Good afternoon. I'm Cristina Arreola. I'm the senior books editor at Bustle. Before we begin, I would like to let you know that books by the authors in this program can be purchased from Greenlight Bookstore outside the building, where the authors will also be signing their books immediately following this program. So please go directly to the signing tables after we let out here. Just as a quick rundown of events, we are going to do a couple of brief readings, and then we are going to have a discussion, and then I'm going to open it up to audience Q&A. So if you want to percolate on your ideas over the course of the next half hour, 45 minutes, then I'm sure you guys will have better questions than I do. You guys always stand me up. All right, so I'm just going to do some quick intros. So first, we have Carmen Maria Machado, whose debut short story collection, Her Body and Other Parties, was a finalist for the National Book Award, the Kirkus Prize, LA Times Book Prize Art Seidenbaum Award for First Fiction, the Dylan Thomas Prize, and the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize for Debut Fiction, as well as the winner of the Bard Fiction Prize, the NBCC John Leonard Prize, and the Crawford Award. Her essays, fiction, and criticism have appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, Granta, Tin House, and elsewhere. She is the writer-in-residence at the University of Pennsylvania and lives in Philadelphia with her wife. Next, we have Madeline Miller, who was born in Boston and grew up in New York City and Philadelphia. She attended Brown University, where she earned her BA and MA in classics. She has taught and tutored Latin, Greek, and Shakespeare to high school students for more than 15 years. She has also studied at the University of Chicago's Committee on Social Thought and in the Dramaturgy Department of the Yale School of Drama, where she focused on adaptation of classical texts to modern forms. The Song of Achilles, her first novel, was awarded the 2012 Orange Prize for Fiction and was a New York Times bestseller. Madeline was also shortlisted for the 2012 Stonewall Writer of the Year. Her second novel, Circe, was an instant #1 New York Times bestseller. She currently lives outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And next we have Anjali Sachdeva. Anjali Sachdeva's fiction has appeared in the Iowa Review, Gulf Coast, Yale Review, and Alaska Quarterly Review, the Literary Review, and Best American Non-Required Reading. She is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and has taught writing at the University of Iowa, Augustana College, Carnegie Mellon University, and the University of Pittsburgh. She also worked for 6 years at the Creative Nonfiction Foundation, where she was Director of Educational Programs. She has hiked to the backcountry of Canada, Iceland, Kenya, Mexico, and the United States, and spent much of her childhood reading fantasy novels and waiting to be whisked away to an alternate universe. Instead, she lives in Pittsburgh, which is pretty wonderful as far as places in this universe go. All the Names They Used for God is her debut book. All right, so we are going to go straight into the readings. They will be short. And Carmen, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So I'm just going to read from the beginning of my story, The Husband's Stitch. If you read this story out loud, please use the following voices. Me, as a child, high-pitched, forgettable, as a woman, the same. The boy who will grow into a man and be my spouse, robust with serendipity. My father, kind, booming, like your father, or the man you wish was your father. My son, as a small child, gentle, sounding with the faintest of lisps, as a man, like my husband, all other women interchangeable with my own. In the beginning, I know I want him before he does. This isn't how things are done, but this is how I'm going to do them. I am at a neighbor's party with my parents, and I am 17. I drink half a glass of white wine in the kitchen with the neighbor's teenage daughter. My father doesn't notice. Everything is soft, like a fresh oil painting. The boy is not facing me. I see the muscles of his neck and upper back, how he fairly strains out of his button-down shirts like a day laborer dressed up for a dance, and I run slick. And it isn't that I don't have choices. I am beautiful. I have a pretty mouth. I have breasts that heave out of my dresses in a way that seems innocent and perverse at the same time. I am a good girl from a good family, but he is a little craggy in that way men sometimes are, and I want. He seems like he could want the same thing. I once heard a story about a girl who requested something so vile from her paramour that he told her family and they had her hauled off to a sanitarium. I don't know what deviant pleasure she asked for, though I desperately wish I did. What magical thing could you want so badly they take you away from the known world for wanting it? The boy notices me. He seems sweet, flustered. He says, hello. He asks my name. I have always wanted to choose my moment, and this is the moment I choose. On the deck, I kiss him. He kisses me back, gently at first, but then harder, and even pushes open my mouth a little with his tongue, which surprises me, and I think perhaps him as well. I have imagined a lot of things in the dark, in my bed, beneath the weight of that old quilt, but never this, and I moan. When he pulls away, he seems startled. His eyes dart around for a moment before settling on my throat. What's that? He asks. Oh, this? I touch the ribbon at the back of my neck. It's just my ribbon. I run my fingers halfway around its green and glossy length and bring them to rest on the tight bow that sits in the front. He reaches out his hand, and I seize it and press it away. You shouldn't touch it, I say. You can't touch it. Before we go inside, he asks if he can see me again. I tell him I would like that. That night before I sleep, I imagine him again, his tongue pushing open my mouth, and my fingers slide over myself, and I imagine him there, all muscle and desire to please, and I know that we are going to marry. There is a story they tell about a girl dared by her peers to venture to a local graveyard after dark. This was her folly. When they told her that standing on someone's grave at night would cause the inhabitant to reach up and pull her under, she scoffed. Scoffing is the first mistake a woman can make. Life is too short to be afraid of nothing, she said, and I will show you. Pride is the second mistake. She could do it, she insisted, because no such fate would befall her. So they gave her a knife to stick into the frosty earth as a way of proving her presence and her theory. She went to that graveyard. Some storytellers say that she picked the grave at random. I believe she selected a very old one, her choice tinged by self-doubt and the latent belief that if she were wrong, the intact muscle and flesh of a newly dead corpse would be more dangerous than one centuries gone. She knelt on the grave and plunged the blade deep. As she stood to run, for there was no one to see her fear, she found she couldn't escape. Something was clutching at her clothes. She cried out and fell to the ground. When morning came, her friends arrived at the cemetery. They found her dead on the grave, the blade pinning the sturdy wool of her skirt to the earth. Dead of fright or exposure, would it matter when the parents arrived? She was not wrong, but it didn't matter anymore. Afterward, everyone believed that she had wished to die, even though she had died, proving she wanted to live. As it turns out, being right was the third and worst mistake. Thank you.
All right, Madeline, do you want to go up next?
Hello. The section I'm going to read is from towards the middle of the novel. Circe is the daughter of the sun god Helios. She's a goddess, a nymph. She's also the first witch in Western literature. And in this section, she has already started turning men to pigs. And the he in the passage is Odysseus. He asked me once, why pigs? We were seated before my hearth in our usual chairs. He liked the one draped in cowhide with silver inlaid in its carvings. Sometimes he would rub the scrolling absently beneath his thumb. Why not? I said. He gave me a bare smile. I mean it. I would like to know. I knew he meant it. He was not a pious man, but the seeking out of things hidden. This was his highest worship. There were answers in me. I felt them buried deep as last year's bulbs, growing fat. Their roots tangled with those moments I had spent against the wall when my lions were gone and my spells shut up inside me. After I changed a crew, I would watch them scrabbling and crying in the sty, falling over each other, stupid with their horror. They hated it all, their newly voluptuous flesh, their delicate split trotters, their swollen bellies dragging in the earth's muck. It was a humiliation, a debasement. They were sick with longing for their hands, those appendages men use to mitigate the world. Come, I would say to them, it's not that bad. You should appreciate a pig's advantages. Mud slick and swift, they are hard to catch. Low to the ground, they cannot easily be knocked over. They are not like dogs. They do not need your love. They can thrive anywhere, on anything, scraps and trash. They look witless and dull, which lulls their enemies, but they are clever. They will remember your face. They never listened. The truth is, men make terrible pigs.
If nobody minds terribly, I'm going to break the unspoken rule of panels and stand up just for this little section because I can see everyone in the middle and the back craning their necks, trying to see the front. I'm going to read just the beginning of the title story here. It's called All the Names for God. Abike stands in the doorway of my room and says, I want to see my parents. Will you come with me? I don't answer at first. I meet her gaze in the mirror but keep wrapping my skirt. Abike's parents have moved to Abuja. My family is also in Abuja now. She knows this. Though I have called them and written letters, I haven't seen my family since Abike and I were captured 8 years ago when we were just 16. She knows this also. It is not a small favor to ask. I finish dressing. All right, I say. We hitchhike for 2 days, take a bus once we reach Karu. On Friday at dusk, when the National Mosque is just lighting up against the sky, we arrive in the city. I haven't been to Abuja since I was a child, maybe 9 or 10 years old, when I came here on a weekend trip with my parents. I peer from the window of the bus at the towering buildings, the sheer volume of people. Let's have a night out, I say. We'll do our visiting tomorrow. Sure, says Abike. Her relief tells in her shoulders. Where do we start? We start at the Hilton. We are still in our country clothes, the same worn clothes we garden and market and fetch water in, and small ridges of dried mud fall from our shoes onto the polished floor of the lobby as we enter. Do you want to do it, or should I, says Abike. As you like, I tell her. She nods and heads to the reception desk. The man working the counter is wearing a black suit and a crisp white shirt, and has the haughtiness so common among people who serve the rich for a living, as if they are superior just from being near other people's money. From across the room, he has been scowling at us with our dirty, rumpled clothes, but when Abike approaches and leans toward him, he becomes nervous. We'd like to check in, she says in English. The name is Okonkwo. He searches the computer for a minute. I'm sorry, madam, I don't see anything under that name for tonight. Abike frowns. What kind of service is this? We've had reservations for months. The man taps at the keyboard weakly. No, I'm sorry, he says. Well, don't you have anything? Is the hotel full? We have some rooms on the 9th floor with 2 queen beds. That's fine, she says, but we're very upset. You should let us have it for free. A family of white tourists has stepped into line behind us, a fat mother and father and 2 skinny teenage girls wearing torn jeans and pouts. The receptionist shifts uncomfortably from foot to foot and looks away, but Abike snaps her fingers and he turns back to her. One of the teenagers giggles, but the man shows no sign that he's heard her. He is eyeing Abike as though she is a dog and he is a cornered rat. I've seen this face before, many times, on many men. This man is used to difficult people, rich people, demanding foreigners. He is used to coolly and politely declining unreasonable requests, but this time he finds he can't do it. He looks as though he would like to cry. Abike taps her fingers slowly against the stone counter, and for a moment, even I believe I can hear the click of manicured nails, though I'm looking at the blunt tips of her fingers. She's very good. I can't, he pleads. I'm not allowed to give rooms for free. Really. Abike's displeasure rolls out in waves. She sets one fingertip lightly on the cuff of his suit, and he flinches. Another employee comes to ask him a question, but he doesn't seem to hear her. We would really like that room, Abike says, and lets the silence accumulate between the two of them like a growing weight. Well, it's our mistake, the man says at last. He puts 2 key cards in a paper sleeve and hands them to Abike. Thank you, she says. She smiles at him and he smiles back idiotically. His relief is overwhelming him. He's so grateful that he has been able to give her what she wants. He nods his head eagerly and she turns to me and picks up her duffel. The tourist family stares at us as if we are museum exhibits, and Abike's eyes are laughing as we head to the elevator.
All right, thank you guys. I feel like it's always going to be a good panel when it starts with men getting turned into pigs and women controlling men's minds, so I feel good about this. All right, I really wanted to start off with a basic foundational question. When we think of myths, we often think of legacy. We think of things that are passed on from generation to generation. So how do you guys define modern myths? And in writing these stories and writing this novel, did you set out to create a modern myth? Do you want to start, Carmen?
Sure. So I think the way that I would define a modern myth would be both the sort of reinterpretation of stories that have existed for a long time. And, when we tell things, everything from like fairy tales and legends to things like children's hand games, right? Like those things absorb their location, they absorb the time that they're in, and they change and move regionally and through generations. And they sort of absorb the DNA of the people who tell them, who use them, who think about them, who pass them on, who tell them to other people. And I also think we have sort of in our modern era also created new ones that like don't have these like old origins. And both of those are really interesting to me. I mean, with this book, the title story, I was really interested in retelling this myth of the girl with the ribbon around her neck, which is a fairly old, Washington Irving wrote about it in his story, The Adventures of the German Student, which was like, a couple hundred years ago. And so it's a story that's been around for a while. The version that I'm sort of working from is, for me, more modern, is the one that I read in like the 80s or the early 90s as a kid. But yeah, it's been around for a long time, so I just sort of put my fingerprints all over it and then like retold it again. Yeah.
What do you guys think? How do you define modern myths?
I will say, actually, mythology is a word that I find to be kind of complicated because I think it's a word that we often use to describe the sincere religious beliefs of people from a group other than our own group. But I think what's important about that is that the people who have those mythologies believe it, right? Like it's their belief. And so to me, a modern myth should be something that has some element of the magical in it, but that you can still really believe. When you read it, it feels real to you, and it feels like a believable explanation for the world that you live in and how that world functions.
So I feel that, and I'll mostly be speaking about the ancient Greek myths in this case, but I feel that the ancient Greek mythology is actually already modern. I don't feel that I took it and transformed it, because so many of these mythological stories, ancient Greece and elsewhere, these are stories about human nature and about sort of things that humans experience over and over again. As you said, they're the stories we pass down, we tell again and again. And so they have resonances for humanity in whatever age we're in. And so what I was sort of hoping to do was to go into this myth that already has all these resonances there, but find a character who hasn't had a chance to kind of tell their story and open up their story.
Yeah, definitely. There is a passage in Circe that just really stuck with me. I'm going to read it very quickly. This is from just after she meets Odysseus. So Circe says, "Later, years later, I would hear a song made of our meeting. The boy who sang it was unskilled, missing notes more often than he hit. Yet the sweet music of the verses shone through his mangling. I was not surprised by the portrait of myself, the proud witch undone before the hero's sword, kneeling and begging for mercy. Humbling women seems to be a chief pastime of poets, as if there can be no story unless we crawl and weep." I feel like this really nicely summarizes a lot of what I want to talk about today, which is in writing Circe, it really seems like you were trying to reclaim Circe's voice and really insert her in a narrative that had kind of taken her voice out of it. And so I would love to talk about how you viewed Circe as a way to really do like a feminist spin on this classic tale. And I would love for you guys to talk about whether or not you saw your stories as sort of like a feminist reclamation of myths. Do you want to start?
Sure. So I absolutely, from the beginning, wanted to, take Circe's story and make this her epic journey. In the Odyssey, she has a very, very small part. She's a cameo. And we learn almost nothing about her. There are a couple really intriguing details that Homer gives us. He tells us that she's a terrifying goddess who speaks like a human, like a mortal. That was a really intriguing detail for me. But pretty much we learn nothing. I mean, here's Odysseus, the most curious man alive. And he doesn't ask her why she's turning men into pigs or how she became a witch. I mean, that to me is shocking. So none of that gets told, and it's this weird tease of an episode because there's all this buildup. She turns Odysseus' men to pigs. Hermes comes and says, she's so dangerous. Be careful. I'm going to give you these magical herbs that will help you. And then, Odysseus shows up and pulls his sword on her and threatens her, and she screams and drops to her knees and begs for mercy and invites him into her bed, and that's it. And she ends up, being incredibly helpful to him after that. But it's this sort of, you're being set up for this really exciting female character, and then, immediately they have to be kind of subsumed to the male epic hero's story. And so I really wanted to flip that, and I wanted this to be Circe's story from beginning to end. She shows up in 2+ books of the Odyssey. Odysseus is in 2+ chapters of this novel, and I did that on purpose because I really wanted to, Odysseus expands to fill a lot of air, and I really wanted to keep him to, he's just one chapter in her life, and how does she get to that place and what happens after are just as important, if not more so. So that was very deliberate and a part of the project from the beginning. And also I wanted to give, epic literature is associated almost exclusively with male protagonists. And so I wanted to have a female at the center of her own epic journey and have her go through a lot of the things that male heroes go through, but that women have been, sort of not allowed to participate in, as well as bringing in things that have been traditionally shut out of epic because they've been seen as not important enough for epic because they're traditionally female. Things like birth or, raising children, crafts, gardening, things like that were all things that I wanted to be a piece of the novel because they're part of her life. And also, if you have the opportunity to write a Minotaur birth scene, as a writer, I do think you have to take it.
What about you, Anjali, in the writing of your own short stories? Like, did you feel like you were kind of giving female voices back or, reclaiming them in any way?
Yeah, in a lot of the stories, I wouldn't say that I consciously set out with that goal, but I certainly am drawn to strong female characters and ended up there. But in other stories, so there's one story in the book called Anything You Might Want that is a retelling of a Polish fairy tale. And this fairy tale exists in a lot of versions across Europe. Basically, it's a woman falls in love with a man, and then for some reason he is spirited away. So sometimes it's the calf skin or the dazzling falcon. Like, this story has a lot of different names. He's spirited away. She has to go through all these trials to try to find him, and by the time she finds him, he's fallen in love with another woman, but it's presented that he's been bewitched, and that's why he's in love with this other woman, not that he's Not that their love isn't true, he's just been bewitched, and then she has to break the spell and get him back. And I read that story and I just thought, I've lived this story at least once, if not multiple times, you know? I mean, how many of us haven't been in love with someone, we work so hard to keep them, and they go fall in love with someone else? And at least me, and I think many people when you're younger, the story you tell yourself is, oh, that witch, she tricked him and took him away from me. And then, 20 years go by and you realize that the witch isn't really the problem in that scenario. So when I retold that story, that's how I approached it, more in terms of, if you thought more about the woman's role in the story, how does that become a different story, and how does the lesson of it become a different lesson?
Yeah, I feel like the idea of like a feminist retelling is sort of a fraught way of thinking about it. For the husband stitch and the urban legend about the girl with the green ribbon, the reason that so initially why I wrote the story is because I was just thinking about, like, the story had sort of always bothered me as a kid and had really stuck with me into adulthood. And when I went back and reread it when I was in grad school, I mean, all the basic beats are in this story. Like, I didn't actually change any of it. I just sort of filled it and inflated it with, like, scene and her perspective as opposed to this sort of, like, neutral sort of, or masculine, like, sort of third-party, like, perspective on the story. So it's not so much like, putting a feminist hat on, like, an old story. I think sometimes people think of it as a sort of artifice, like, well, the real story is this thing, but the feminist thing, the feminist retelling is like those feminists putting their hands all over it, and doing what they want. But for me, it was just like, no, I'm just really interested in, like, looking at the story more closely, because when I reread the Green Ribbon story, what I realized it was a story about male entitlement, and I didn't have to, like, do any weird mental gymnastics to get there. Like, you just read it, and that's what the story is about. It's sort of like when I first met my wife, I remember we were talking about fairy tales, and she was talking about the Frog Prince, the story with the golden ball, which she says is like the rapiest fairy tale there is, because it's basically about a frog who's like, you promised me that I could eat by your plate and sleep in your bed, and now you've changed your mind, and that's not okay, and the king makes her do all those things because she promised. And you read it, and it's like, again, you don't have to do any kind of weird mental gymnastics to have, like, a feminist retelling. It's like you're reading a story about a woman who's being forced to do these things against her will, and she says, no, I've changed my mind, and no one listens to her. So, but of course it has a romantic sort of twist, if you can call it that. So I don't know. So I feel like, obviously they are feminist in the sort of traditional sense, or the sort of very literal sense, but I always sort of hesitate a little bit to just think of it as, like, I don't know, I feel like people sort of say feminist retelling of XYZ, and then that kind of is the end of the conversation. And I think, for me, it was just more about, like, looking at these texts and saying, like, what are they actually telling us? Like, what are they showing us? And that's more interesting to me.
Yeah, definitely. It's like you mentioned, how did he meet Circe and not ask about the pigs? Like, it feels like less of a feminist retelling and more like a fuller telling of the story, because you are finally including the female voices in that. So, often when we think about myths and fairy tales, we think about, like, the moral of the story, like what is the lesson learned. When you were writing, your own modern myths, did you have in mind that there was going to be a moral of the story, or was that something that you wanted to subvert in your writings? Do you want to start, Anjali?
Yeah, so I'm one of those writers that I never know the endings of my story until I get there. So I certainly don't set out with a moral that I want to communicate. It's more that I write most of the story, and then and maybe I even write an ending, but then I take a rest and I go back and look at it, and I try to figure out really what the story is trying to say. Like, usually there's some idea in there that I was not consciously putting in there, but it's appearing throughout the story. And so then when I revise the story, I try to make that note more pronounced. And I will usually adjust or sometimes completely change the ending to illuminate that idea. Because short stories, at least in my opinion, really live or die by their endings, and so much of what the reader takes away from the story comes in the last few pages. But when I look at traditional fairy tales, so many of them are constructed as sort of warnings to women. in terms of if you don't behave in this tightly prescribed way, such and such horrible things will happen to you. Or, no one will want to marry you, which is the worst possible thing that could ever happen to you in a fairy tale. So I definitely had a sense of, in the stories that were, for me, retellings, that was not the message that I wanted to convey. And again, kind of picking up on what Carmen just said, I think it was a question of just going back to those stories and thinking, if these were real women, what lessons might they really find for themselves in these experiences that were their own realizations and not this tightly structured societal expectation for them.
Do you guys have anything to add?
I actually have like fake morals in here. I'm just trying to find them. Because I am really interested in that sort of language. Oh my God, now I can't find my own. I'm like, it's like I've never seen this story before ever in my whole life. Yeah, but the sort of idea, I think, right, so there's like, at some point she says like, I don't need to tell you the moral of the story. I think you already know what it is.
Yeah, and there's one where she's like, I think the moral of the story is that like being poor is bad.
Oh, well, being the poor will kill you.
Yeah, being poor will kill you.
And she also says like, brides never fare well in story. Like, there's like, she sort of is repeating or sort of saying these like sort of truisms or morals, but they're not real. Like you're sort of meant to sort of interpret them ironically. Or with some sort of level of distance to them. But yeah, I similarly, so Anjali, I don't really start off like having like a sense of what a story is going to be about. Or sometimes I'm exploring an idea, but like I'm never quite sure what it's going to end up as. And in fact, like I've actually used writing stories to arrive at things that I believe myself. So like I have a story in my collection that actually initially was a retelling of The Little Mermaid, and then I got so far away from the source material that I don't really say that anymore. So spoiler alert, or Easter egg, 8 Bites started off as a Little Mermaid story. But initially, when I was writing it, I knew I wanted to write about fatness because it was really important to me, but I wasn't sure sort of what I felt sort of politically about the stuff in the story until I finished it. And then I kind of almost like helped myself reach my own moral, or not moral, but like my own sort of thoughts. And so, yeah, the story was just like trying to build a path to the thing that I actually thought about this particular issue. So yeah, but I feel like I use them sort of like ironically, but I never like want someone to be like the story to end and it be like saying this to you, like I want the stories to be expansive. I want them to have a lot of openings and entrances. I want them to have a lot of space for the reader to sort of occupy. And I think that's something that people forget is like, some people think of text as this like dead lockdown thing, but actually text exists like for you, the reader, to like sort of press yourself into it and enter into it and like have a relationship with the text, which is why like if you read the same book over and over in your life, it'll read differently to you every time because like you are a different person. And so even though the text is the same, like you have changed. So yeah, so for me, I'm more interested in like giving the reader a space to like enter in and like do their own shit in the story. And that's more interesting to me than like a moral or a lesson.
Yeah. What about you, Madeline?
So Greek mythology is a little bit different because it doesn't have those strong morals the same way that some fairy tales do. I mean, there are certainly morals you can tease out, the story of Daedalus and Icarus, don't fly too close to the sun, which is a terrible moral. Don't try. Don't go after things you like.
Don't have any ambition at all.
That's right. No ambition. Mostly they end in death. There's a lot of, and I think that word moral is important actually as we're thinking about it, because we talk about the ancient Greek heroes, Achilles and Odysseus, as heroes, but that word didn't mean the same thing to the Greeks that it means to us today. The word hero we use to talk about moral exemplars, people who are virtuous or courageous or in some way good. They do good in the world. I think both Achilles and Odysseus do much more bad in the world than they do good. They sort of rain down destruction on people pretty much wherever they go. And that is what it meant to be an ancient Greek hero. You had faults that were as huge as your virtues, and you made horrendous mistakes, and you often caused, terrible things to happen to the people around you. And so, I didn't sort of have to grapple with that idea of a moral the same way when working with Greek mythology, but I certainly did want to One of the things about Circe's myth that's really interesting is she's one of the very, very few female characters who is not punished for having power at the end of her story. It's really surprising because usually, the woman has to end up dead or, horribly tortured or something like that. And so I was really interested in that idea that, how does she emerge in this incredibly hostile world that is not going to hand her that happiness in any way or that sense of comfort in herself or that independence? And how does she fight to get there? And what's the cost of getting there? The Odyssey, when you boil it down, what it is, gods and monsters aside, this is the story of an exhausted veteran who is trying to get home to his family, who has seen horrors for 10 years and then spends another 10 years experiencing horrors and sort of what that re-entry into his life might be like. And I wanted that grounding to stay very much there for Circe, that, this is a story of a woman coming of age and coming into her power, who is born into an absolutely horrendous family and tries to, can she get out and can she fight her way through? I did actually have the ending in mind from the very beginning. In the case of both my novels, that was true, that the ending was right there. But like you, as you said, Carmen, I think I discover the themes as I go along. That, I knew the ending, but that didn't mean that I sort of knew why that ending made sense until I got there.
Wonderful. All right, I have time for one more question, and I'm going to open it to the floor. I think we may only have time for one or two. But I did want to talk about the female body and the way it's described in various degrees of horror in a lot of your books. There's a Minotaur C-section in your book. Women literally disappear in your book. There's a woman who withers away slowly and her body falls apart. Why was that something that you felt was important to address in your modern myths?
I feel like for me, it's sort of a twofold element. On one hand, all bodies are it's all body horror. If you when I was a kid, I read those Redwall books, and there was always a threat that the weasels would say, and they'd be like, "I'll show you the color of your insides," and I was like, "Oh my god, what are the color of my insides?" And there was something. So all bodies have sort of an inherent element of you age, bad shit happens to your body. It's really just having a body. Period is a nightmare. Mm-hmm. And then you add to that the marginalized body, the queer body, the non-white body, the female body, the and there's this element of also what is done to you because of your body. So it's not it's bad enough that you already have this body that bleeds and stuff, and then also you have people who are because of XYZ, your body is forfeit, your life is worth less than someone else's life, we won't, and so it's sort of this weird two-part so I'm really interested in both of those things. So in this book there's a lot of vomit and zits being popped, and I've had people I once read a scene with a popping zit at a reading, and this guy in the front row was like, oh, no, he got really upset. And I was like, yeah, because the body's a nightmare. But then also I was really interested in thinking about not just that stuff and that gross, deliciously gross stuff, but also what is sort of done to the body and what people are trained to do to their own bodies, which is especially, in this case, women, which was very important to me as well. So yeah, so that was sort of my body approach, I guess.
Yeah, what about you guys?
Well, I think one thing for me is that women are often taught to keep all that body horror that everyone has, the sort of messiness of being alive, very much concealed, and to make it seem completely effortless, as if there is never anything untoward happening. And so I really wanted to take those moments of birth, which are incredibly hard on the female body, and really have them happen and experience that. And it's not something you can paint over or shut out. It should be part of experience. And Circe also has a incredibly terrible sort of case of morning sickness all throughout her pregnancy, all day sickness. So there's vomiting also. And migraines, and I wanted to sort of be honest to women's felt experiences, which so often get kind of wiped out of the record.
I think for me I do feel like so much of mythology and fairy tales are based on the creation and dissolution of the body. I mean, if you look at the Greek myths, people are constantly being turned into flowers and trees, and Zeus is always taking on different shapes. And I grew up reading a lot of Hindu mythology where the gods and goddesses appear in just various forms all the time. So I think partly, to me, it is just part of how one tells a fairy tale. But if you look at Western fairy tales, there's so many where it is expressed specifically in the mutilation of women. I mean, if you think of like Cinderella's sisters chopping their feet up to desperately try to get their foot into the shoe, and then at the end of the story their eyes are pecked out by birds, which oddly Disney edited out, but you know, that's like that's how the story really ends. And so I think that really just I think so much of Western fairy tales focuses on the problematic aspect of that and not on the more kind of the possibilities of the body, and that I find intriguing to me.
Wonderful. So we are going to open it up for questions. Does anybody have anything they would like to ask? Do you want a mic? Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I teach a freshman writing class at City College, and my co-teacher teaches the literature section on Freudian psychoanalysis and literature. I told her about your book in 6 Bites, and we noticed that the characters are not named. So we were wondering if that was intentional and how you constructed that story.
You know, it's weird that people oftentimes will say, like, oh, you did this thing, like, tell me about the whole process behind this. And it's like, at some point an interviewer asked me, you know, most of the women in your book, in your stories, are not named, especially none of the protagonists. Like, what's that all about? And I was like, I did not notice that before you pointed it out to me. So the reality is, like, a lot of times, like, people ask you about your book, and you're like, I didn't do that on purpose. But the general thought process behind that story was I had been asked to write for an anthology of fairy tale retelling. I had sort of had this long-standing idea of taking Little Mermaid and thinking about like bodily transformation, and I wanted to write about gastric bypass surgery and fatness and mothers and daughters, and they just sort of worked together. And then eventually I rewrote the story so much that the sort of original fairy tale material kind of dropped out, that there's some little leftover bits. There's like Dr. Yu, who's like Ursula, and then there's like Pomeranians instead of eels, and I've got like little twin Pomeranians. But yes, so that's kind of how I wrote it. But yeah, no, if I had a reason for not naming them, make up some answer for me. That sounds really smart, but I didn't do it for any particular reason.
Wonderful. Do we have any other questions? Yeah.
I have a question for Madeline, which is, I was just wondering if you had read Emily Wilson's new translation of the Odyssey, and if you had any thoughts about having, I think it's the first translation of the Odyssey by a woman, so if you had any thoughts on that, I was just wondering what they were.
Yes, I have read it and I love it and I would highly recommend it. If you want to read more of my thoughts, I actually ended up reviewing it for the Post. She's amazing. Yay, Emily Wilson. I think, you know, what she has gotten a lot of attention as the first sort of published English translation as a woman, but I want to highlight that it is an incredibly intelligent translation. She's so smart, and you can feel that intelligence in absolutely every line. She's thinking about, I mean, it's almost like reading a commentary on Homer. That now makes it sound really boring, so let me add that the other thing she does, aside from just engaging with the text in a really intelligent way, is that she makes it really fun. You know, the Iliad and the Odyssey, these were stories that were entertainment. People listened to these, you know, on purpose. And I think she really captures that sense of excitement and that forward motion. And, you know, there were moments when I was reading it when I was thinking, is Odysseus going to make it? You know, and I feel like that's sort of the ultimate test. So I think it's wonderful, and I also really like how she does a lot of the stuff that we're talking about today, where she sort of opens up, she finds kind of these spaces of silence, and she opens them up and allows a lot of the female characters to just shine in their place. But she also does something that I feel like is really important, which is in translations. Some of you who know the Odyssey may know the story of the maids that Odysseus orders chopped into bits, and then Telemachus ends up hanging them instead. But these are the maids who were slept with the suitors who have been pursuing Penelope, and so they have to be punished as well. The maids is the typical translation. That's how we talk about them. These were slaves. This was a slave society. Almost all the lead characters are aristocrats. And she uses, so the word in Greek means like female house slave. And, but somehow it's become maid, which I think to a modern audience means something very different. And so she has gone back to really emphasize those moments where we've kind of let that like ugly slavery thing drop out and brought it back so we can really kind of see this culture as it was more clearly.
Sure. Awesome. Have either of you guys read it? No. All right, so unfortunately, we have to wrap this up. I wish this panel had been about 3 hours long. Thank you for coming. The authors are going to be signing at signing table 8. And thank you so much to the 3 of you for being here today. Yeah, of course. That was amazing, guys.
That was great. I could have. That should have been 3 hours.
Yeah, we could have talked for
I could definitely have listened to you guys for 3 hours. So that was awesome. Thank you so much.
No, it's okay.
Thank you.
It's not your fault.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you so much for
Oh, and you guys need to take your signs to your tables.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming. I don't know.